So let's go ahead and create a add transaction component so we can use it in our main.js. So make a new file, call it add transaction.js, and also want to make this a React functional component, just like I explained last time. This is just going to be a functional component, and our main.js is going to be our Redux class Redux component, because we are using Redux, so we need a class component. But as for add transactions.js, we don't need the class components for this. Okay. So I want to import this add transaction inside the main.js so we can display it. So add transactions and click enter, and it will automatically import it for you. If not, import it by itself. Also want to close this, and so I'm just going to put some text. So add transaction component. Now if I save this, as you can see, it's being displayed over here. So let's remove the text and actually start with this component. So we want to have a h3, and we'll just say add transaction, and let's see how that looks. As you can see, it says add transaction, and we have this line. This is from the styling that we had in app.css. So basically I have h3, and we're changing it, so we're giving it some stuff, border bottom. So add transactions.js. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually have a form for creating a transaction, and inside this form we're going to have a div with the class name form control. I'm not going to explain these class names, just for styling so you don't get bored. So class name form control, we're going to have a label. So there's going to be a label for one of the inputs, which is the text inputs for our transaction. So he's going to be able to put in the amount and the text, and the ID will do it automatically. So yeah, so we're going to have a label text, and we're also going to have an input for the text. So input, and we're going to give this input placeholder, which is going to be enter text dot dot dot, and we're also going to have a type for this input, which is going to be equal to text. And what else? That should be it for now. Let's just see how that looks. Okay, as you can see, we have a nice input. This is all styled with our app.css. So we're going to have another one of these, so just copy paste it for our amount, and it's just going to be amount, and enter amount, and instead of text it's going to be a number. We want the amount to always be a number. So now if I refresh, as you can see, now we have this. So lastly, we're going to have a button to actually submit this form. So let's go do that. So outside this div, just create a button and add transaction, and just give it a style of class btn. So class name is equal to btn, and save that. As you can see, we have now a beautiful button. Okay, so now let's work on actually adding the transaction. So when he types in a text and types in his amount and then puts in a transaction, I want to work on actually submitting that transaction to Redux persist and saving it over there. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we want to do is have a state. So we're going to use the useState hook, React hook. So let's do const. We're going to have text and set text. And I'll explain this in a bit. Let's just finish this and set text, sorry. And this is going to equal to useState. And the initial value of text is going to be an empty string, and we need to import useState. useState. Okay, so basically we're just making the state is kind of like a variable for this component, and so this is going to be the state text, and we're going to have set text, which would be a function to change this text, change the value of this text, and whatever we put inside here, which we put empty string, is going to be the initial value of text. So we want to link this text to the input of text, so value equals text, because later on when the user clicks the button and then submits the form, what we want to do is we're going to set the text back to an empty string, and we also want the input to be back to nothing, the value of it. So we're just going to put the value text, and this will all make sense when we actually add the transaction, so don't worry if this doesn't make sense right now. Okay, so what we want to do now is if you've actually installed this extension that I told you about, the ES7 React Redux, then you can do Option Shift F to make the code neater for MacBook, and if you're using Windows, then you can do Alt Shift F. Okay, so now for this form on submit, so we can check if the form has been submitted using the button, and then we just want to call a function called onSubmit, and let's actually create this function. So we're getting an error because onSubmit is not defined, so let's do that. So const onSubmit, I'm going to make it an error function, so equals error function, and we'll be receiving an event. So so the form, when we do onSubmit, it will automatically pass the submit event to our function. So this is going to be an error function, and we want to do event.prevent default. That's the first thing we want to do. So what this does is when we submit a form, it automatically refreshes the page. So and it does some other stuff as well, the default stuff. So we just want to prevent this, and we want to do our own stuff. So when he submits this form, we want to get to the text that he put and the amount, and we want to create an object with that and set it in the state, and then we'll add the transaction using Redux. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we want to do is create the object. So const new transaction is equal to an object, and this object would have an ID, which for now I'm just going to set it to 0 just for now, and we're also going to have some text, and that text is going to be equal to the text inside the state, so our text state, and the value would be basically the same value as the input. So text is equal to text. So when the input changes, we want to change the text as well, so let's actually do that. So onChange, so we'll do onChange on the input, and we'll do an arrow function, and we'll receive the event of the onChange, and we'll do set text, so we'll change the text based on the input value, and we can get the value from this event doing event.target.value. You can console.log event if you want, and you can see what it contains, but if you don't want to, you can just do event.target.value, and that has the value of the input. So text is now going to be the value of the input. We also want amount, so let's actually do that now. So amount, so we need to do the same thing for our amount input. So let's give it a value of which is equal to amount. So we need to actually create this amount state. I didn't do that. So const amount, and then set amount as well to set the amount, and use state. And initially we're going to set it as 0, so the amount is going to be 0. Sorry, I have 2 S's here. I'm going to remove 1. And so the value is going to be amount. I have an error because I haven't set amount. Okay, so the value is going to be amount, and on change, so when the value of the input changes, we want to pass in the event to arrow function, and do the same thing as we've done with the text. So we'll do set amount, and then pass in event.target.value. And now we want to set the amount to amount from state. Okay, so let's console this new transaction. So we're not actually adding a transaction right now, we're just creating an object for that transaction. So let's just see how it looks. So new transaction, and let's see if it actually works. So let's inspect element, open our console. Now let's put some text, put some amount, and as you can see we have this object with the ID and text and amount. So for the ID, we want it to be the last transaction's ID plus 1. So each ID has its unique ID. So a lot of people just do math.random and do it like from 0 to 1 million, so they just get a random ID, but that's not really right. So we want to actually so each one has a unique ID. So let's go to main.js, and to add transactions we want to pass in ID. So this ID is going to be equal to transactions. So first we want to check if there's transactions. So transactions 0. Let's check if the first element is there. So what we're going to do is when we add a transaction, we're going to add it at the beginning of the array. So the first transaction of the transactions array is going to be the one with the newest one, which is going to be the one with the biggest ID, and we just want to increment that by 1. So first we're checking if there is a transaction. If there is, then we want to do transactions 0, so the first one, which has the biggest ID, .id, plus 1. and that would be our new ID. Otherwise, if there is no transactions, then the ID is going to be 1. So it's basically that if there's no transactions, then this is our first transaction, and our first transaction is going to have the ID of 1. So let's receive this ID in our add_transactions component. So just like I told you, you could do props and then props.id or object destructuring. So I'm just going to do object destructuring, so ID, and now instead of 0, we're going to actually have an ID. So now let's refresh this. So we already have, okay, so let's refresh this, SS. So right now we have nothing in Redux persist. Well, actually no, we do have 4 stuff. We have 4 transactions. So we're meant to actually make the fourth one, the one with ID 4 at the beginning, because that's how it's going to be done. So we're going, so basically it's just going to get the first one with the ID 1 and increment 1 right now. But when we actually add the transaction with the Redux, and we don't have dummy data, we have real data, the ID 4 is going to be at the top, and ID 1 is going to be at the bottom, and it will take the ID 4 and increment 1. But right now ID 1 is the first one, so it's going to actually give us an ID of 2, as you can see. So right now this would be an issue, but this is just dummy data, and when we actually implement it, the ID 4 is going to be at the top, and it will take the 4 and add 1, so it would be 5, and each one would have a unique ID. If this doesn't make sense, don't worry, it would actually make sense when we create the add transaction action in Redux and we actually implement adding a transaction. So let's finish this off. So after creating a transaction, we want to, okay, so now we're going to do that part with Redux. So we want to actually add a transaction to Redux. So to do this, we need to go to our Redux folder and go to actions.js. So we want to create a new actions. So let's do const, make this capitals now, and do add underscore transaction, 1s, sorry, and copy this, and this equals to a string with the same thing. So you will see why we're doing this right now. So we're going to have const add transaction, const add transaction, like that, and this equals to an arrow function, and this arrow function takes in, it will take in the transaction, so transaction, and we're going to be returning an object, sorry, so let's actually do that. So do that and then return an object, and then this object is going to contain an action and the payload. So the action is going to be equal to the add transaction, so add transaction. So you could just put a string of add transaction, but this is better. It's better to do it this way. So I want to export this as well, and export this. So yeah, so action add transaction. You could just put a string, like I said, add transaction, but it's better to actually store this string inside the const and then use it over here. And also the payload is going to be the transaction that is being passed in, so the transaction itself. Okay. And Redux and in Reducer we'll be receiving this action, as you can see. So now that we're receiving this action, we have many actions. We're going to have many actions, so we're going to need a switch function. So switch, and the switch is going to be based on the action, and then we're going to have case add transaction, which we're going to import right now from add transactions. From actions.js. So we imported it automatically. And if this is the case, then we want to actually implement the add transaction function. So let's do that. But first I just need to fix something. So we're going to do it based on action.type, and in actions.js this is not going to be action because this object is going to be the action, and this would be the type of the action. So sorry about that. We need to fix that. And now, so the type, if the type is actually a transaction, then we want to add a transaction. And then we want to get a copy of the state, and then a transaction. We want to change now the value of transactions, which is from our initial state. So we want to do, first thing we want to do is do this, colon, and then we'll have an array. But we need to actually return this, so let's return this first. So return as an object, Control V. So basically, okay, I'll explain later. But .state, and then so returning a copy of the state plus the transactions, and the transaction is going to be an array of the action.payload. So I'll show you what this is. So action.payload is the payload as over here. So as you can see, we have payload, and the payload is set to the transaction that is being passed in that we want to add. So action.payload, and we also want to do state.transactions. So state.transactions. So remember how I said that the transaction will be added at the beginning of the array, this would be the newest transaction and it would have the biggest ID, so we can just add 1 to that. So this is what I mean, we're passing the transaction at the beginning of the array and then putting the rest of the state over here. So okay, so now that we can actually add a transaction and we are returning the full state now. We want to have a default case, so default is just going to be returning a state. So if we're not actually having a action, then we just want to return the state. So do that, return state. And now in add transactions.js, so main.js is our Redux component. So we need to change this action to a prop over here, map dispatch to props. So we'll do add transaction, and you can name this whatever you want, but I'm going to call it as add transaction. And this would be equal to an arrow function which would take in the transaction and then would dispatch our add transaction function inside our actions.js. We're going to dispatch this, so we go to add transaction main.js, and we'll dispatch add transactions. So import that. It automatically imported it for me. Otherwise, import it for yourself if it didn't. So import it like this, and I want to pass in the transaction. So basically, we have an error. Transactions is not defined. Oh, sorry, transaction, not transactions. Okay, so basically we are we're getting the function from Redux, the action, and making it into a prop for this component so we can use it, just like we did for the state. So this is an error function that would dispatch the add transaction function, and it would pass in the transaction. So this add transaction function is from our actions.js, as you can see over here, and we are passing in the transaction, and we are receiving it over here and passing it in as payload. The type is add transaction, and this action will be passed into Redux over here. We are getting it over here, and we are checking the case add transaction. So if it is add transaction, then we would create the transaction basically now. So now if I go to main.js, now we have the add transaction. So we want to do object destructuring and receive it as props as well, just like we did with the state, because this does map dispatch to props, so it changes the actions to props for us now. And we want to pass in this add transaction to our add transactions component. So paste it in here, and when we call this prop and add transactions, we'll be passing in a transaction, and we'll be calling our add transaction function, this one from Redux, and we'll pass in the transaction. You can just do it like this. So remove all this and just do add transaction and call the function, but just this makes more sense so you can understand it. So we'll be receiving the transaction from the add transaction, which would let me just show you right now. So we're going to receive this as props, the function add transaction, so like that, and then we'll call it over here add transaction, and we'll pass in our new transaction. So new transaction. So we're calling the add transaction, passing our transaction, and then going to main.js. As you can see, we're here. When it is passed in, we'll receive it as transaction, call the add transaction action from Redux, and pass in our transaction, and then Redux would receive that and return an object with the type, which is a transaction, and the payload as our transaction, and then in the reducer would receive the action and would actually create the transaction. So now we can delete this dummy data because we don't need it. So this is going to be an empty array, and now let's refresh. This is still $55. So the cache, our data has been cached. So let's go to application and storage and clear site data, and now if we refresh, as you can see now it's 0 because we have nothing in transactions. So basically our data was cached. So now let's actually add the transaction. What I want to do is actually console.log the transactions, because we're not actually displaying it right now. Or actually no, the balance will change, so we don't need to do that. So make a new transaction, for example rent, and the amount will be $20 for example, and then add transaction. As you can see, it was meant to be minus 20 because rent is minus, it's expense, not income, but this is just for testing purposes, and as you can see the balance has changed to $20. So if I just add now rent minus 40, so rent number 2 for example, and then minus 40, this should change to minus 20. As you can see the balance is now minus 20. So now that we can add transactions, we need to actually display these transactions so the user can see it and he can remove it if he added it by mistake.